And I'm Megan Angelini, the Assistant Director of ASM Press. And we're so happy to be here speaking with these three authors of Food Microbiology and Introduction, the 5th edition.
I'm Karl Matthews. I'm a professor of food microbiology at Rutgers University in New Jersey.
Hi, I'm Callie Kniel. I'm a professor at the University of Delaware in the Department of Animal and Food Sciences.
Hi, everyone. I'm Faith Critzer. I'm a professor at the University of Georgia in the Department of Food Science and Technology.
So let's dive right into our questions here. So what inspired you to write this book, and how has the field of food microbiology evolved since either the first edition or maybe previous editions that you've worked on?
You know, I'll start in. So maybe because I've probably been with the textbook the longest, about 20 years now, and really the one of the drivers for me to be involved in this was just my passion for food microbiology. I just really enjoyed understanding how microorganisms behave in the different environments that they might be found in, and particularly those that are associated with foodborne illness. The other side of that is that I wanted to be involved in putting together a textbook in which the students would want to turn the page. Food microbiology might not always be the most exciting field, but I think that's one reason why, if you look at the chapters, we've actually incorporated at the beginning of many of the ones that have pathogens, an outbreak scenario. So it kind of grabs their attention.
And I'll add on to that I think food microbiology is a really tangible science. It's very meaningful to students, and the textbook describes concepts that people are familiar with, like fermentation and foodborne illness, but really brings that science alive in a easily digestible format for them. It's a very unique book in that way.
Yeah, and I'll tack on, I'm the newest author to this group. And one of the things I've always admired about this textbook is that it is very much a conversational tone, right? It doesn't feel as austere and kind of foreboding as some textbooks do. It is meant to be that conversation and accessible by students. And I think that they feel that when they get in and dig in and read. So I think that, I'm happy to join this team because I think that they've done an excellent job in the past. And I think we've continued with that track record in this newest edition.
I would absolutely agree with that.
Just looking at the continuing on with the same, question or line of thought is that, how has food micro evolved over the time? And I just see tremendous, changes if we're looking at whole genome sequencing, next generation sequencing, probably the utilization of AI within the arena of food safety. So there's just so many changes that have taken place. And I think, just from my perspective, the greatest changes that have taken place is, initially having Callie come on board and then having Faith come on board, because they've offered, a new perspective, and, they're bringing out pieces of information that maybe I would not have thought about bringing to the forefront.
Definitely a very strong, excellent team you guys have going on. So moving on to some talk about the 5th edition specifically. So can you talk a little bit about some of the updates that are in the 5th edition?
So we have one new chapter on antimicrobial resistance. That's now a new chapter unto itself. And I think that this reinforces the concept that solutions to AMR, which is a global challenge, will only come from One Health solutions. And in order to really understand the issues associated with AMR, we have to put them in context of the food system, which is a global food system in itself. And so I think our readers and educators who use this textbook will really be happy to see that that's a separate chapter now unto itself.
I agree. We also have done a kind of overhaul. We always kind of put things when it comes to food safety and food systems within, there is always an overarching regulatory context. So within the United States, which also impacts the global food supply, since we have so many trading partners, we've done a really good job of going into Chapter 7, which is our regulatory issues chapter, as well as Chapter 30, which is our food safety systems chapter, and giving the provided updates there. Because, as with everything, things are constantly evolving, and we want to make sure that our readership has the most up-to-date information when they're out there using these textbooks, either in the classroom or just for their own personal knowledge.
And so I think it's kind of amazing to me is that, we didn't visit beforehand, Faith, Callie, or myself, but the areas that I was going to bring up were exactly that. The chapter that we had on antimicrobial resistance, the chapter on regulatory issues, and the chapter on food safety systems. I really think they do encompass a lot of what we're looking at from a global perspective. And that's what I think one of the biggest changes that I've seen with this text really over the years is that we were pretty US centric. And now we're looking at more from a global perspective. And that's where I really think that, those chapters truly embody that.
And so kind of springboarding off of that, you've touched on it, obviously, in the answers to the previous question, but how does the book, address the challenges of ensuring food safety in this globalized food supply chain?
Anybody want to go?
I can jump in. I'm happy to start out. I'm sure that you all have, really great thoughts here, but I think it does a really great job of covering current knowledge of our bacterial, viral, and parasitic foodborne pathogens. And, go figure, these pathogens never have a GPS, right? So they're of global importance across the board. And I think, in various countries, there may be some pathogens that are focused on more than others based upon the diets and ultimately their ability to discern when disease is occurring. But I think that it does provide that really nice platform for people to get a strong foundation of understanding when it comes to that. I think it does a really nice job of showing how these organisms are introduced to foods. And we have done a really good job of going in, and as we learn more, we update the textbook to show and reflect that. And I think we do a nice job of also not only telling you about the organisms of concern when it comes to food safety, but also looking at mechanisms of control. And, ultimately, this textbook is meant to be just a start, right? If you want to use it as a beginning point. And we've done a really, I would say thorough job of updating our suggested reading list to newer references and things to kind of help people if they want to learn more, open that door, and also revising our questions for critical thought and really looking at that in a more global and holistic manner and bring in, our readers from all throughout the globe.
I will just add to that, which was an excellent answer, that within each chapter, there are several boxed items. And specifically in many of these chapters, the boxed pieces really reflect unique global issues of concern. And I think it's fun for students to flip through a chapter and then say, oh, what is that about, right? And you see this picture and this image, and you can read this side story that then fits into another chapter, or maybe even addresses other issues in other chapters. But I really love the way that we put those together. So I think the formatting of the book is also just a way of showing that this is a global issue of importance. And we also address, I think, food waste is a really important global issue across the supply chain. And we address that from different perspectives, from detection and recalls of foodborne pathogens to spoilage organisms and control, as Faith just mentioned, and then also food fermentation is a big piece of this. And so I think you see pieces of that throughout the book as well.
I'll just add a touch to that because I think they've really encompassed well with what we've tried to accomplish in this text. And indeed, I think the international contributors that we have for box material provide the reader with this sense that, what's going on from a global perspective. It's not just so confined to maybe the country that they're in which they're utilizing this textbook. And, the other side of that, too, as I've mentioned it before with outbreaks, I think we've included some of the outbreak scenarios that are not just within the United States, but that have occurred in different countries throughout the world. And so, again, kind of bringing the reader this global perspective on the issues of food microbiology and food safety.
Great. So moving on, what are some of either your favorite or the most exciting developments in food microbiology that you've covered in this edition of the book?
Why don't you lead us off, Karl, if you have it?
Well, you know what? So I'm just, there's so many things here, but I think, if I look at some of the more exciting developments and so forth like that, and we actually have box material on this that our contributors have given, but looking at the application of next generation sequencing in the arena of food microbiology, looking at metagenomics from that particular perspective there as well. I think some of the changes that we've made as far as the updates and revision with respect to biological, chemical, and physical-based preservation methods, the utilization of phage, the utilization of probiotics and phytochemicals and what have you. So to me, these things are all kind of exciting new additions that we put in that tie into food microbiology and, broadly food safety. The other side of this, too, is I just really look at the way we've gone through, and, I believe this was Callie's chapter on parasites, and just the revisions that were made to that and the updates on that. And again, maybe for the United States, parasites are indeed an issue, but if you go globally to many countries, particularly low-income countries, parasites are a huge concern within the food systems, the food supply. So those would be the few things that I think were kind of, things that came to my mind.
So I would just add to that, one of my favorite parts of the book that I think is also very exciting is the detailed aspects of the different pathogens. As Faith mentioned, this is an introductory book, but we cover so many different unique aspects of all of these different pathogens, from the virals and pathogens and the parasites, and then also all the different pathogenic bacteria, and they all have their own unique sets of characteristics that make them pathogenic or allow them to survive in different foods or be transmitted in different ways. And we touch on all of those. And I think just being able to get a sense of how different and unique these organisms are, yet we think about them so often and we often classify them together or group them together, but they really are so unique in their characteristics and their pathogenesis. And those traits, I think, are really detailed well in the book.
I think that Karl and Callie have done a really great job of summarizing some of my thoughts. I would say the only thing I would add, and it's one thing that I know appeals to a lot of students, as we learn more about how impactful like gut microbiome is and everything, and people are looking at, sources of microorganisms, and clearly foods come to the forefront there. I think that students really enjoy the chapters on fermentations, both lactic acid bacteria, as well as yeast and other microorganisms. And I think that they're really great resources. So while, we're microbiologists who work in the arena of food safety, a lot of times we tend to talk a lot about the foodborne pathogens. Note there's also really great content there that will give students a really great understanding of how these organisms can be incorporated into foods, or overall benefits in food preservation, which is why we use them for literally centuries, but also how we may be able to then utilize them better in the future as people do get more dialed in. Normal consumer, I don't think when I was growing up thought very much about, the microorganisms that they are consuming and their overall health and impact on their well-being. So I think that's really great content also.
As a non-food microbiologist, I'll say when I was editing the book, pun intended, I thought cold plasma non-thermal processing was really cool.
Mhm.
It is really neat.
Moving into sort of like the broader realm, how do you see the role of food microbiologists changing over the next decade, given current trends in food safety and technology?
I think Carl's touched on it already, but I think genomics, as you know, up until now, we may have been looking through like a spyglass, right, to try and ascertain the ecology of a food or something along those lines, like microbial ecology of a food. Now we're going to have far greater information provided to us with the development and advancement of tools we have for looking at that. So I think, molecular methods are not going away. It doesn't mean the standard applied methods aren't going to be utilized. They definitely have a place and a time, but I think that the use of molecular methods are only going to continue to advance, and they're going to become more and more important to us.
Mhm.
I think another piece of that that's going to continue to evolve and change is how food safety and food microbiology is a piece of product development. We see continued discussion of food processing and what does that mean? Well, we have to think about how does that affect the microbes, and when we want beneficial microbes to survive certain processes, we still have to think about how those organisms are interacting with the ecology of the food. And we want to do that in a way that doesn't necessarily impact all our natural resources, right? When we think about producing food and the development of new types of food. So I think that food safety and food microbiology is going to continue to be a really big piece of that.
I'll just add to that from the standpoint of looking at food microbiology / food safety, and even the role that I believe it will have even a greater role when we're looking at food security and food sustainability. Because of the fact of what we can do with some of these food microorganisms from a beneficial standpoint, and then also from the area of looking at controlling foodborne pathogens to ensure that we do have an adequate food supply throughout the world.
So how can students benefit from this new edition?
So I'll just maybe put in my 2 cents on this as far as, I think where students can benefit is, I believe it was Faith had mentioned this too, is that it's more from a conversational standpoint that we're putting this forward, this text. And I think the students can benefit if they actually take advantage of reading the box material that we've included in here, looking over some of the figures where we go through, and they always say, it's kind of a cliche that a picture's worth 1,000 words, but many times those figures and diagrams really pair so nicely with the narratives that have been included in the text. And so I think those are going to be able to help the students comprehend and retain this information. I also think that when we're looking at this, is that the students are hopefully getting to see food microbiology more through a global lens, because we've tried to incorporate that throughout the text, regardless of the material that we're covering. I believe, we've done a nice job of trying to include what's going on at a global perspective and scale.
So I will add on to that. I think that there are these examples in the textbook that are very unique to students, that provide them with contemporary issues that they might hear about and that they don't necessarily apply to food microbiology. For example, we see certain threats to food safety as a result of climate change. And one of the issues that we've brought up is things like rising seawater. And how do those temperatures of rising seawater temperatures, I should say, how does that increase Vibrio vulnificus infections? And so there's some really interesting data that is in various chapters of the book that ties together contemporary issues that I think students might not necessarily say, oh, food microbiology, I see that. There are issues of climate change that are important to that, but I think they could really see how microbiology is this globally important science.
Yeah, I think that what Callie and Karl have talked about is perfect, and that it book really does a nice job of connecting the dots from like the facts basically to how we then apply those, right? And what it means for us in certain contexts. And then I think once you start making those connections, it's easier for students to see how it can be connected in ways that we don't even describe, right? Because ultimately that's our goal, is that, when they need to pick up this information, maybe, 5 years from now, maybe 10 years from now, that we've given them a nugget, right, that'll stick around and they'll remember it and be able to go back to it and reference it, for the task that's currently at hand. And I think if you're not a good storyteller and do not make it applied, then it's easy for all that information to get lost.
Mm-hmm.
Great. And then sort of a similar question, but I guess more from the flip side. How can either instructors, professionals, researchers, et cetera, benefit from this new edition?
So I guess I'll start. So as educators, one thing that's really important to us is that we encourage critical thinking, right? Not just rote learning and memorization, but really to critically evaluate the information that's given to you. And I think one of the things that we've done is to redo and I guess we've really updated them, but we've updated all the critical thinking questions, I think, from a unique perspective. Some are more case study based, or could allow an educator to develop case studies based on different topics. I think it allows educators to explore different realms within their classroom, depending on what might be of interest to them. I think from a researcher, there's lots of good information, as well as those different papers that we link to that are available. So I think that there's just a lot of good information that's available to professionals and researchers, as well as the educators.
Yeah, I think that with each edition, it's essentially a snapshot in time, right? So this is our snapshot in time for as it stands right now. And, we've alluded to the things that we've really focused in on, looking at things from a One Health perspective, a global perspective. Sustainability was definitely thought about when we were writing these chapters. I think that, in the next iteration, it'll be a different topic, right? And that's true for this iteration. So I think that for all those professionals out there, it is a really nice one-stop shop, where instead of you spending time and getting it from numerous sources, we've done a really nice job of trying to collect it all here and making it pretty comprehensive. And I do think that there's a lot of advanced concepts around policy development and food waste, and kind of wrestling with those two ends of the spectrum, and also looking at, new kind of discoveries that we've made with these organisms that we've been working with for decades, and that, further readings that we recommend. So I think that it is a really nice job in doing that. And I think for the educators, hopefully we packaged it in such a way that they can then dig into the things that interest them and the students that they're teaching, and can springboard off of it and really help engage them in the classroom.
There's really not much to add to that. I think Kniel and Faith did an excellent job in encapsulating the text and what it can bring to whether you're a professional or an educator. To me, it covers the A's to Z's of food microbiology. And so that's what I kind of like about it. And as Faith was indicating, it's kind of a one-stop shop in that, even if you want to use AI, it's still going to take you time to sort through everything. And this text has it right there for you at your fingertips. So I think from that perspective there, it really does a nice job for across the board.
Well, thank you so much for this exciting and engaging discussion about the new edition of Food Microbiology and Introduction.